thank you. Hello, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you here. I think I'm just waiting until I get presenter mode here. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the science and the future of iTree. And so I'm going to go about 20 minutes on, really briefly, on the introduction of iTree, so everybody's on the same page, and then talk about the science. We'll have 10 minutes for questions, then I'll talk about an iTree update for about 50 minutes, and we'll take questions after that. So iTree was a concept that was developed, was released in 2006, developed in the early 2000s, based on a public-private partnership with some of the partners aren't showing up on the bottom there. Forest Service, Davy, International Society of Horticulture, Society of Medicinal Arborists, Casey Trees, National Arbor Day Foundation, and SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So I don't know why some of their logos aren't showing up on the bottom, but there's many people that work on this from different offices. And it's basically a public-private partnership to develop tools to guide managers to assess the current or future effects of their forest, to look towards optimal tree planting. If we want to make the forest better for the future, first we have to understand what we have and then help to make management decisions to guide that to a more sustainable and resilient forest in the future. So it's been many people working on this and trying to engage the public in stewardship by providing them information about their forests. So we're coming up on year 10 next year with this tool. And the purpose is basically to guide management decisions with the best available science and local data. Managers are going to make decisions about their resource, whether they have information or not. So the concept behind iTree is to provide managers, land stewards, easy ways to get this information about their forest so they can make management decisions. So we want to engage it. So half the work, I always say, is about developing the science behind it. Half the work is trying to make it easy so people don't get disengaged in collecting the data themselves. So it's designed to collect local data. And people have used it in many different ways to help with management plans, advocacy, education, tree planting goals, etc. So that's the concept behind the model. Is the model perfect? No, but it's actually quite good in what it does. Does it do everything? No. Will it ever do everything? No. But we're adding more and more features to it and more services each year as we develop this tool. So it's an open public-private partnership. We're looking for ideas. You as the consumers can send us ideas as to what you would like. There are currently 7 tools. I'm not going to go through them. I'll show you some new ones coming up at the end of this talk. But ECO is the basic core calculator that takes in field data to assess what you have in services provided and values. Design focuses, Streets does the same thing for street trees. Design focuses similar information but uses Google Maps to engage people on a mapping technology. Landscape's a new tool. I'll talk about that later coming out today. Canopy is a photo interpretation tool to help you rapidly assess how much canopy you have in an area. Species is a quick tool to guide you as to what species to select. And Hydro is a hydrologic model that simulates stream flow and water quality effects from the forest. So general overview, hopefully you've seen these tools. I'm not going to go into them. But what I am going to do is talk about some of the science. We are currently over 36,000 users in 120 countries. We have versions that are released for United States, Canada, and Australia, and we'll be releasing one for the United Kingdom later this year. So we have many partners across the world, or users across the world, and partners across the world. Now towards the science, the basic structure or design framework of this model is structure, function, value. This is critical. Structure is what you have. Whether you're in your backyard or a park or a whole city, the model needs to know information about your forest. This is the most critical piece, and this is many things that managers may or may not know about their forest. If you're going to manage your resource, you have to know what that resource is. So part of the tool is designed to help you understand how many trees you have, what's the species composition, what's the health, because this is the starting basis of what we build this model off of. Once we know the structure, and to us critical is leaf area, we can then bring in local data, pollution, weather, and simulate those trees to provide various functions that we'll talk about, energy conservation, pollution removal, and those functions have a value to society. So if the user provides the structure to the model, structural information, could be 1 tree, could be 1,000 trees, the model will then take local data and estimate the various services or functions provided by that forest and values. The reason why this is critical is that if we want to design for the future, we are designing for functions and values for future generations, but it all ties back to structure. So if I want to improve air quality, the question is what species should I plant and where should I plant it? It's all tied back to things that we control, somewhat that we control, is that function. We make decisions on what to plant, what to remove, and we manipulate the structure of that forest. But by changing the structure of the forest, whether we do it directly through planting and removals or that nature does it through storms or insects and diseases, any change in structure is going to have a rippling effect on the functions and the values. So what we're trying to do is figure out understand what these values are to the current forest, but then how should we plan to design the forest to optimize these functions for future generations, given that many things are changing, climate change, insects and diseases. That's the whole concept behind the model. So getting to the science, the model itself is good at estimating population totals. We have more discrepancy when we predict individual trees. And the reason is because many times when you collect data on a tree, you make a direct measure, we know what that tree is because you made the direct measurement. But what you didn't measure, say, was leaf area. So then we use equations off of your data. So you tell us you have a red maple that's a certain size, canopy, and in a certain condition. We will estimate leaf area. Leaf area is a critical piece, as is leaf biomass, the weight of the leaves. But when you go to equations tend to predict to the mean. So what will happen in the end, if you have enough of a population, we're very good at estimating the population, but we may be off on the individual. Best example I can give on this is, let's say you measured DBH, but didn't measure any, DBH being diameter of the stem, and you didn't measure any of the crown parameters. Well, we could use them, and we do this. We can make an equation that says, okay, I have a red maple that's 14 inches in diameter. The model might predict that the height of that tree would be 40 feet, okay? Well, if I'm trying to predict the individual, this is where it becomes difficult because I don't know if that tree is 40 feet. I think over a population of trees that are 14 inches in red maples, the average will work out to be 40 feet. So the model works well over the population because you get some that are higher and some that are lower, but on average it works out fine for the total. The problem is when the model goes to predict an individual tree, it's going to say 40 feet, and you walk up to the tree and say, well, this tree is 60 feet, or this tree is 20 feet. The model's not off, it's just that you didn't measure the height of that tree. And that's why I say structure is critical on this, particularly with dimensions of the crown. We really encourage people to measure the crown dimensions because the more you measure of the structure, the better the model becomes. But in essence, when we go to the individual tree, on average we'll be fine, but we may be off on the individual. So if we predict the height of a person walking in the room and Shaquille O'Neal walks in the room, we're probably going to underestimate his height for the individuals. But overall for the population, we'll be fine. So the concept is ease of data collection versus more variables and instrumentation. We're trying to make this model as easy as possible with as few data requirements needed as possible so to make it easier on the users. We typically have, I think, like 9 variables that we require if you want to run everything. You may want to collect more yourself, but there are core things we have to have. You have to tell us the species and DBH. Then we bring in local environmental data from your city, the pollution and weather, and this has another issue. We don't know the weather conditions in your backyard, nor do we know the exact pollution conditions in your backyard. We use the monitors from the EPA and the monitors from the Weather Service and take the average of the monitor data for the region. So that means if the average temperature in your city is 72 degrees, everybody gets 72 degrees. So the model is back again to the population average. It works well across the city on average, but it's going to miss your backyard temperature because we don't know, there's no monitor data for the backyard. To get around that, to get at local variation, you can see we're using NEXRAD, which is radar-based precipitation data. So instead of using one rain gauge to collect the data on precipitation, we can actually use radar now. We're building that into the hydro model. We're adding infused data from the EPA, which estimates pollution concentrations at a finer scale than just using the monitor data. Monitor data is point data where they collect within the city. And we're building a new temperature model that can estimate air temperatures hourly at about a 300-meter resolution data. So we're trying to get to this local variation, but right now the base version uses local data, but it's averaged across the city. And again, structural variables are critical for the premise of this model. To get at structure, there's 2 ways. You can go top-down or you can go bottom-up. Top-down will tell you how much cover you have, or where the cover is, but it relates to cover. It's sort of two-dimensional. You can use iTree Canopy to photo interpret your area, and you can get cover within probably 2% accuracy for your city within a day. Or you can use UTC maps, these high-resolution cover maps, which will then display where the cover is and how much cover, but again, it's still two-dimensional. That's the top-down approach. Bottom-up, we go in the field. We need information on sizes of the trees. We need information on leaf area, information on species, information on condition. That's the bottom-up approach. If you collect every tree in your area, let's say you have 10 trees in your backyard, that's an inventory. In the case of the model, if you put 10 trees in, the model will give you estimates for 10 trees. There's no bound of error on it. We assume that the data you put in are measured without error. So if you tell us that it's a red maple and it's a Norway spruce, the model's not going to know. But we assume that it's measured without error, but there's no sampling error if you count every tree. Often it's inefficient across a city basis to measure every tree, so we go to a sampling procedure. This is where we have the issue of standard error. Standard error is a measure of how precise the estimate is within a certain bound. So if we estimate 1 million trees, it'd be plus or minus, say, 100,000 trees. It depends on how many plots you put in and how much data you collect. So we have standard errors on the measured variables because you've measured them directly. Number of trees, diameter, species counts, heights, things that you measure are very straightforward on standard error. No problem with that. We use standard statistical techniques to do that. However, when we take derived variables, which means you've measured DBH and crown parameters, and we estimate leaf area, or we estimate leaf biomass, or we derive the functions from those estimates, we are still using the sampling error as the estimation of error, but there is also an error of estimation, which means that the formula we're using has a set of error that we really don't know what that is. We're assuming that those formulas are accurate. And most everybody in modeling has the same issue. We're good at the sampling error of measuring the trees. When we go to derived leaf area, we assume the formulas are correct, and actually we've tested the formulas other people have, and the formulas work fairly well. We're underestimating the true error of the estimation because of the models that we use. We don't know the model. Hopefully these slides will be distributed. We're just going to show you some of the structural references. There's a lot of data behind the measurements of structure. Again, this was the first thing. We started this with my dissertation back in '91. We've had papers through the 90s and 2000s of how do we measure structure to get at estimates of the basic core information. How many trees do we have? How do we photo interpret? There's papers on testings of the leaf area indices and derived estimates from that. Also plot precision, how many plots should we have? So there's a bunch of data out there on structural references. We're pretty solid on estimating the core structural data. So now we move to what do we calculate in terms of the benefits. The yellow ones here, air quality improvement down to health benefits, are things that are in the model already. The green are ones that we're working on that will be out in the next year or so. So we're trying to derive all these new services and benefits and values. Basic concept of the model is shown here in the schematic. The user on pointer here, if I get it to show up. There it is. The user enters the field data. That's what you're required to do. You're required to tell the model what do you have. You can again count the trees or you can sample. Because we don't know what forest you have. All we know is, if you tell us, is where you are. So the user's entering the field data. Behind that, there's a database of 6,400 species right now that has information about the trees. There's location information for every city in the United States that contains the weather data. It also contains the pollution data. So you don't have to get that. It's all in the background information. All this pre-data down at the bottom loads into iTree, and you load the field data in. And so we're going to talk about the processes behind in this box here, and outcomes information for you on structure, air quality, stormwater runoff reductions, carbon, energy, and various valuation processes we're going to talk about next. But that's the basic process. You're required to put the tree data in and tell us where you are. So the functional processes, this is where the link. You've given us structural data. We feel comfortable on that if it's measured without error. We have to, the science behind this is building a link in between the structure and the function. So if you have a red maple versus a sugar maple, if you have so much cover, more cover versus less cover, or certain locations, how do we determine air pollution removal? How do we determine energy? and what is the impact of that air pollution removal on human health? And that's what we're trying to get at. So we have a lot of peer-reviewed papers on the methods. There's additional documentation on iTree of all the specifics of the methods that may not be in the peer-reviewed journals but are more detailed on the web page. And then we test the outputs against measured data where possible. And we match up fairly well on many of these. And we'll talk about this coming up, of how well we match for the various routines that we run. So air pollution removal, the model's based off of leaf area, the leaf area that's provided from the trees that you measured, your hourly weather and hourly pollution data. And what we've built is a dry deposition modeling routine that basically does gas exchange on an hourly basis based on the weather and the leaf area that you have. And the hourly rates that we measure, which are called deposition velocities, are in line on an hourly pattern, both in magnitude and pattern, with measured data from field stands. We give you max and min values based on the maximum and minimum, so that's how you know the uncertainty of the measurements versus what the model actually predicts. And the limitation we have on this program right now is drought. We assume urban trees have ample soil moisture, that they do not go into drought. We are working on a drought routine right now because they tested it in Rome and the model matched up very well, except for in Rome they go into a drought, so midday we would overestimate, and we knew we would. The issue that we have of bringing a drought routine into urban areas is when to turn the drought routine on. Because there's data that we have that shows that even though the natural forest goes into drought, many urban areas do not go into drought because of supplemental watering from humans or leaky pipes. So this is another issue. Even if we put the drought routine in, we don't know when to turn it on or where to turn it on. So we're working on that right now. And you can see below that there are various papers that detail the methodology behind that. But we're pretty good on the hourly rates of removal line up with the data. And so we're pretty confident with this model. And you see there's a bunch of papers here that document the methods or the outputs from these various models. Carbon stores and sequestration. In this case, we use species, diameter, condition, location, where are you in this country, and crown competition, is it open grown or in a forested stand. And we basically use allometric biomass equations that predict biomass based on DBH and height for various species. That's for carbon storage. For sequestration, we take the storage numbers and we grow the trees. And tree growth is based on the condition of the tree, which means dead trees sequester no carbon, they don't grow. Length of growing season, which is the location data. So trees in Georgia will grow faster than trees in Minneapolis because they have longer growing seasons over for annual rates. And crown competition. So open grown trees will grow faster than trees in closed canopies. We have, I think, 64 carbon equations in there right now. We're adding many more from forest inventory analysis and wood density conversion factor, so this will be updated in the next year or so with new equations or more equations. The certainty of the estimates, our standard error is based on sampling error, which we talked about earlier. And the rates, which is the standardized rates, which means how much carbon do you have per meter squared of canopy cover, are right in line with the forest inventory estimates, plus or minus fractions of a kilogram per meter squared. So we feel confident that our numbers are in line with measured field data, which are often based on other models anyway, so we're comparing model against model. The difficulty of this process is if we knew how much carbon we had, we wouldn't have to model it. And because we're measuring the diameter and the height, and we have multiple equations that are being used, we take the average of all the equations that are available for that species, is we feel fairly confident the numbers are fairly close based on the measurements of those models. If you really wanted to know how much carbon you have, technically you should probably just cut down the whole forest and weigh it and figure out the carbon, but you still have a standard error associated with that. But because we can't do that, we have to use models, and that's the process. We line up with measured data from various studies there. And you can see here, again, this was started back in '91, and there's various papers that document the method, but that's a general overview of the science behind that. Oxygen production is pretty much the same as carbon, it's just inverted. So if a tree is taking in carbon and growing, it's giving off oxygen. If the tree is decomposing, it's a straight conversion. It's consuming oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide. It's the same method that I just talked about, but it basically is based on the measurements of the tree and these equations to predict biomass. VOC emissions, that's volatile organic compound emissions. They're chemicals given off by plants, and they vary by species that lead to ozone formation, depending on weather conditions. So what we use here is your daily leaf biomass. So the leaves in the model change daily based on length of growing season. So mid-season, all the trees are in leaf, and winter season only the evergreen trees are in leaf. And we do that daily. We take the hourly weather data and we use what's called the BICE modeling methodology, which is the Biogenic Emissions Inventory System produced by the EPA. And you can see the papers there below that detail that methodology. Certainty of the estimates, again, we test the standardized estimates of emission rates per meter squared of forest type from the EPA versus what we're coming up with, and we're right in line with what they have too. I mean, they're obviously going to vary slightly, but they're not off much. And they will vary because based on species composition and weather conditions. So we're quite comfortable that these numbers are doing well. We are going to add standard errors to these coming up based on the standard error of sampling based around leaf biomass. Now, getting into energy conservation, this one is dependent upon tree height, the condition of the tree, distance and direction from a space-conditioned building, and geographic location. And geographic location has to do with weather conditions and energy costs. This is all built off of work of Greg McPherson and Jim Simpson. You can see the document there. And they did a bunch of model runs using MicroPass and Shadow Pattern Simulator that has this lookup table that says for various size trees and various distance and directions, here's the energy impact on these two-story buildings that they modeled. And so the modeling was good that they did. The question is, the certainty of the estimates, we don't know, because we're relying on the lookup tables. We don't know the variations, and what we do is update the energy costs locally, but the model simulations are all built off this MicroPass and Shadow Pattern Simulator modeling that they did. It's pretty much used for the U.S. conditions. Hydrology, which gets at water flow in streams and reduced runoff. Again, we use leaf area index or leaf area, hourly weather data, digital elevation maps. And we look at the precipitation coming in. The methods are based on what's called the top model design. The model is calibrated against stream flow data. So we know that the model's simulating, well, you know what, in the calibration, how well the model's simulating actual flow data. And then what you do is you change cover and impervious in the model to see how the flows have changed. We're also working on trying to do model simulations to look at if you vary temperature of various parts, how these models, bound of certainty might change based on input data that might change the outputs a little bit. So we're fairly comfortable with that because we are calibrating against measured stream flow data. Models in development. The process to get into iTrees, the papers, the methodology to go from structure to function has to go through a peer review process. So there are 6 pieces that you saw on the green slide earlier that we were working on. 3 of them are ready to go now because they've gone through peer review. And that's what we're working on right now. So truthfully, when we start the process, it probably takes about 4 to 5 years to get it into the model. So we have to do the science, we have to write the papers, then we have to write the code, and then we have to write the interface to make the code easy for people to use. So these are the ones that have been through peer review already, and we're working on the code right now to get it out. So it'll probably be out, all of these will be out next year, I would bet. And it's air temperature effects, which will go into landscapes we'll talk about later, wildlife habitat, and UV radiation reduction. So there's more coming. Ending here, I only have a couple minutes left here for this part of the talk, is value processes. So now we've gone from structure to function. We say you have this many trees, you have this much carbon, this much pollution removal, or whatever. How much is it worth? Well, it depends on various processes. We probably hang our hat most on the functions. The valuation will show you how we do it. If you don't like our valuation, some of them are straight multipliers. You can just change the multiplier yourself. But we've gone through the literature and basically come up with this methodology. So for structure, what is the value of the current forest for the structure? We use the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers approach. You can see a couple papers there to get an estimate of what the value of the current structure of the forest is. For pollution removal, there's 2 methods. One is called externality values, which are estimates of the external cost of having pollution in the atmosphere based on human health costs, cost of damage of materials, visibility, damage to crops. Economists estimate this in a value per ton of pollution. It's a constant value that's applied as a straight multiplier. So if a tree removes a ton of ozone, a forest removes a ton of ozone, you would multiply that ton by a value of dollars per ton, which is probably on the order, I think, around $6,000 or $7,000 per ton for externality. The new approach we're using is BenMap, which is an EPA benefits mapping program, which ties the change in, what we do in the model is estimate change of pollution removal to change in concentration in the atmosphere. Then we link that change in the atmosphere to how many people are being affected by that change in the atmosphere within this Ben map model. It says, okay, if we have many elderly people or young people, it's susceptibility to certain diseases or heart attacks, asthma, mortality. So we're using the Ben map process and the Ben map valuation. So now it gets very locally specific. So if there are no receivers of the benefits, the value of the pollution removal goes down. If there are more receivers and some pollutants are worse than others, like PM 2.5 or ozone, which create mortality, the values go up. So you're getting a variation in value. So we've linked to the EPA Ben map model as of last year. But you can also do externality, which is the older way we used to do it. Carbon, we use the Interagency Working Group report on social cost of carbon. It is about, I believe, around $138 per ton of carbon right now. We use the 3% discounting rate in the report, but we're using that's the U.S. government values. If you don't like it, in the model you can change it, but we're going with whatever the U.S. says. Energy, we use the state average state utility costs as reported from various national organizations. We update that every few years. That's a straightforward multiplier. Lastly, runoff reduction, we use average treatment costs from a report by McPherson, Pepper, and Vargas. They have 16 regional community tree guides. We took the national average of effects per, or cost per a gallon of reduced runoff. Oxygen, if you read the paper down there, we wrote that in '07. Oxygen actually has no value, and there's a reason behind that is because there's so much oxygen in the atmosphere. The change in oxygen, the marginal change is not worth anything. And VOCs is tough to value because VOC in and of itself is not really the issue. It's the conversion of VOCs to ozone and particulate matter that are important. So we have to figure out, and EPA does this with larger models, to convert the VOC to the actual pollutant. Then we can value the impact on the pollutant. The VOCs will be a negative value, but it's very difficult to value that directly without converting it. I think this is my last slide before questions. Differences here. Two models, ECO and design. ECO is the core engine, and design is the one that uses Google Maps, requires field data. You have to measure trees. Moving down below, if we go to the top-down approach, which is Canopy, which is the photo interpretation program, and Landscape, which is coming out this year, which I'll show you later, it does not require field data. This is what I call an entry-level program, if you will, is that we are loading all the national maps from NLCD into this. I'll show you this coming up. And we're estimating the effects of carbon based on state or county averages, and then pollution, which is state or national averages for carbon, county values for pollution. We run the whole country, all the monitoring data in the country for pollution and weather. So you're getting county-based estimates per meter squared that are being applied to the map. It's not based on your local data. It's only based on your local tree cover, based on NLCD, which tends to underestimate tree cover. But it gives you an idea. I'll show you coming up. It's very quick, very easy to give you a ballpark estimate. The hope is that Landscape will engage people to collect data going back to ECO. And once you collect data in ECO, that data from ECO can be passed back to the mapping program to give you your local values will then be applied. And you're not relying on state averages or county averages. Your local data will load in. But I'll show you that coming up, and that's the new thing coming out next year. But it's really simple, and it will engage, hopefully, a lot of people in terms of landscape scale issues. So with that, I will stop. I went a little bit long, and we have time for questions here. So last thing, this is fairly quick. There are three things I want to talk to you about an iTree update that we're working on. One is urban FIA, which is Forest Inventory and Analysis. Two is our 2015 release, which is coming out later this summer, and specifically what's new, which is related to iTree Eco, Forecast, and iTree Landscape, and then upcoming features that we're working on over the next couple of years. And Ian, that web service might be one of those upcoming features. So urban FIA, the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis measures forest data across the country at a rate about one plot every 6,000 acres. So they're our national inventorying group for forests. We started pilot testing doing urban areas in the late 1990s. We started in Indiana, did Wisconsin, then Tennessee, Colorado, and we're out west right now. And we were doing it at state assessment levels, following their grid of about one plot every 6,000 acres, doing the whole state areas. So we had about 15 years of pilot testing iTree and this process at the state level. Well, last year in the Farm Bill, urban FIA was introduced in the Farm Bill. At that point, the shift went away from the states to looking at metro areas, similar to what we've been doing in iTree. So the Forest Inventory Analysis Group, which is our national inventory group, we partner with them. We were working with them in the past, but now we are going into merging iTree systems with FIA systems so that the Forest Service will have a national urban forest inventory, and they started this last year. And let me explain this a little bit. It is a panel-based system, and what that means, let me step back. I'll explain that in a second. The differences between FIA plots and iTree plots typically, iTree plots can be any size you want. Typical users collect about, in a city, about 200 10th-acre plots to do their assessment. And the reason for that is that's the way I started back in the early 90s, and it's about what a crew of two can get done in the summertime. FIA, when they're doing cities now, are doing, because their plot design's a little bit different, they are doing 200 6th-acre plots. Their plots are bigger than ours, which is okay, and they have micro plots, which means within a plot there is a plot. So they measure all trees over 5 inches on the 6th-acre plot, and in the micro plots they measure the trees that are under 5 inches, or pretty much all trees on the micro plots. iTree collects all trees over 1 inch across the whole 10th-acre area. So it's slightly different in protocols, but similar processing, so that's not going to be the problem. The other difference is this panel-based system. So you can see the first 2 cities we did in 2015 is Austin, Texas, and Baltimore, Maryland. Austin did 200 plots across the whole city last year. They did all 200 in the first year. Baltimore is on a 7-year panel, which means they did 1/7 of their plots last year, and they're doing the next 7th this year. So after 7 years, they'll have all 200 plots collected, and then in year 8, they'll remeasure the first-year measurements, and year 9, they'll remeasure the second-year measurements. So it's a rotating. You measure plots every year, but at 1/7 the frequency on a 7-year panel. Austin did all of them at first, and now they're jumping to the panel system, so they're measuring 1/7 this summer, but they will be able to show change analysis because they have the base data in. iTree, typically, I don't think anybody's done a panel outside of the U.S. Forest Service, is not a panel-based system. We typically measure all the trees 1 year and come back maybe 5 or 7 years later and remeasure all the trees again. We don't have this annualized panel system. And there's a reason why the panel system is a good idea, and there's efficiencies and inefficiencies of doing so, but it's up to the users. But FIA is on a panel-based system except for the ones that have asterisks. So this year, they are going into Houston, and they're doing all 200 plots. They're doing Madison and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, St. Louis, Missouri, Providence, Rhode Island, and Des Moines, Iowa. How do these cities get selected? It's based on partnerships. So if you are interested in your area, you have to talk to Greg Reams or Mark Majeski or somebody and say, but you have to come to the table as a partner because the Forest Service is not coming in to do these unless they establish partnerships to do so, which is a great way to do it. And that's the way we typically work with iTree. Unless you do it yourself, if you partner with us, if we're coming in, we need a partner. The goal is incorrect there. I typed that in wrong. The goal for the U.S. Forest Service is eventually to cover the top 100 metro areas, not 200. So many areas will not be covered. People can always use iTree, and it's going to take a long time to get in there. You can see they did 2, and now they'll be up to, will that be 8 cities after next year, and they'll be doing continuous measurements. So it's up to finding those partners to get in there. And I think that's all I have to say on that. It's a good program. We're working on integrating the systems. There are actually meetings today this week with FIA trying to integrate their system within ours, but you'll be able to do what FIA does in these cities plus what iTree does in these cities, and eventually the iTree users will gain because we'll be adding some FIA statistics to the urban areas, such as maybe board foot volume and timber and downwoody debris and things like that as optional variables. So it's going to work its way across based on partnerships. Okay, where are we going? For 2015, the version coming out this summer, there are 3 probably flagships that are going to be in here. One is ECO is updated. If you're familiar with ECO, this slide shows you the new interface. Totally new design, help menus right there alongside, much more engaging, much more modern interface. What's new is where the arrow there is forecast. This is what we just talked about a little bit earlier. In forecast, you can take your ECO data that you put in there, whether it be an inventory, In this case, you could put an inventory of just the trees you planted or your existing tree forest, and you can simulate the future, which means it'll grow the trees, so the trees will increase in size. It'll kill trees off based on a mortality rate that you will assign. Excuse me, there will be default mortality rates. And you can also plant trees. And so it's up to you. It's basically a population simulator based on those three factors. There are, as you can see, canned scenarios. This is not the final look. This is an early mock-up. And management scenarios. So we're trying to do pre-canned scenarios. And some of those are insects and diseases. So you can take your population and click emerald ash borer and assign that to say, I want to kill off all trees that will be attacked by emerald ash borer within 10 years. And so they're pre-canned ones that it knows. There are, I think, 31 insects in there. It knows what it attacks, and you can assign a mortality rate to that. You can also do canned storm scenarios and say, I'm going to have a windstorm come in and do something, but it'll show these effects of what happens to the forest itself and some of the services that are provided by the forest. This gets into this, what we ultimately want to do is getting to optimization. How do we have the best forest for the future? It means we have to consider time as a variable in this process along with the services. So we're trying to work towards that in the model. This is about 10 years in development building all this forecasting tool. So that'll be out in ECO. Oh, the other thing with ECO is Streets will still exist, but Streets is being merged within ECO right now. If you're familiar with Streets and you're familiar with ECO, they do similar things, but Streets was designed for street tree data. ECO was designed for any tree data. Streets processes uses reference city data that have lookup tables. ECO uses locally derived variables from the weather and pollution and your locally derived data. So the advantage is you can still run your street tree data, but no longer are you tied to the lookup tables. You can do everything you did in Streets, but it's now tied to your local weather data, your local pollution, so you don't have to worry about the reference city. So if I'm, 100 miles away from the reference city, it doesn't matter anymore because now you can grab your local data in ECO and run it live, basically, without having to look up tables. So you get the best of both worlds there by being able to do the street trees. Last one here. This, to me, is the most exciting to us, is landscape. And this was a huge piece of work. We've loaded all the national land cover, tree cover, and impervious cover for the lower 48 states, because there are no data for Alaska and Hawaii, into this system. And where available, the local UTC data, which is that high-resolution tree cover maps and impervious cover maps, into this system. I'm going to basically sort of walk you through this in slides to show you generally what it looks like. So you would hit the, right there, the Get Started button. This is the mock-up of the first screen. And then basically, oh good, I got the arrows in here. You would type, the map loads up here. You would type your address in. In this case, I typed in Syracuse, and the map would zoom to Syracuse. Within here, then you can pick layers that you want to analyze. Some of these are crossed out because they're not in yet. We're going to add congressional districts. We're going to add national forests and things like this. So that's your bounded analysis. So within each of these polygons here, throughout this region, we have data associated with that. So what you can do is then you go down here, you can click on canopy cover, impervious cover, or in this case I clicked on land cover. So it loads the national land cover data. So if you're familiar with this takes like 2 seconds. In the past, you had to download all the national land cover data. It took a while to do this. It's all pre-processed, excuse me, and loads up right for your area. For anywhere in the lower 48 states, you can do the same thing with the impervious cover map and the tree cover maps. And right here, there's the tree cover, so you can see the same layers. And you can put all three on if you want. It looks a little funky, but then you have transparency bars here that will change the shading. I don't know why you would put all three on, but sometimes you get so many colors going together, but you can do that if you want. And then you can do is you can select up here. You can select what areas you want to look at. So these are 4 block groups. You can also do drag and click. Like you can drag and click your mouse and create a box, and everything within that box will be highlighted. So you can do these zoom selections. Then what happens, I'm not going to show you a lot of this, there's a process statistics button. It basically shows you down in here, it'll give you statistics for every one of those block groups, or if you did the counties or whatever you did, it'll tell you the amount of canopy cover you have, the percent canopy cover, impervious cover, and percent impervious cover. It'll show you all the land cover statistics, how much is forest, how much is developed, and it actually has not all the census data, but much of the census data for each of those block groups, how many people, minorities, income, education. And if you're familiar with census data, this was not a minor task. This is huge because it's very quick and it loads all the census data. We had to write our own special code just to extract census data, but it's all loaded in there for you. We will also show you the information in per meter squared, so you might want to know, not necessarily this number, but number of people per population density, or some of the services per canopy cover. And so here's the land cover data. You can see developed open space, developed low density. So all the statistics for those blocks that you picked are there, and the census data, but it also shows you the services. It'll give you carbon estimates, air pollution, and hydrology, which is reduced runoff. And it's for each of the block groups. It'll give you the total carbon, total sequestration, the values. Same with pollution. I'm not going to show you all these in hydrology. You can then sort these columns and highlight certain ones. We're working on making this more visually attractive, because in some ways, technically block groups, as you can see here, are defined by a census number. It means absolutely nothing to me or anybody else, but you can click on it. There's a highlight button in the new version which will highlight which of these block groups is actually the one you're looking at, because they don't name block groups like they name cities. They're all a number code. So there are ways, when we release this, there's going to be, some people are looking at it already to give us ideas. We're always making this, Mike Binkley and Kevin and many others are working on this to make this more easy to use, and they're doing a great job. This is an earlier version that I have. So we're really excited about this one coming out, again, later this summer. But everywhere in the United States, it'll give you information about your area in a map-based process. So you can change tree cover and see how the services will change. You can specify certain areas, show me blocks that have, you know, meet at least a minimum carbon storage or whatever you want to do. We're not sure what you want to do. There is an optimization routine right now which will select the block groups for priority planting based on areas that might be underserved. So areas that have high tree cover and low population might be lower priority than areas that have high population and low tree cover. And that's what we're working on the next year, is trying to get this optimization. And we're also adding many new layers. So what you're going to see coming out later this month is just the first version. And there's so much more to be coming with this, but this was 1.5 years in the making, and you don't need ArcGIS. It runs right off the server, and Mike and Kevin and others did an excellent job in putting this together. We have others working on how to optimize. In this case, what we're trying to show here, and this is what we're working on, is where the pollution is. As I talked about that fuse data earlier, it looks at population density and population concentration. So in this quadrant in the upper right are the areas of the city that are have the highest density of people and the highest exposure to PM 2.5. So these blocks here are the ones that are the most polluted and have the most people receiving the pollution. So it gets to this idea of how do we optimize. We are doing the same thing. This is the priority planting, which will already be in there. We're doing the same thing. This is PM 2.5 I just showed you. We're doing it for air temperatures, thermal comfort, and UV radiation protection. So the idea is, in the coming years, if we have all these layers, you can start optimizing where you want to do the best priority plantings or priority protection of canopy cover based on who's receiving the services and what forest you have, the distribution of the forest. Upcoming features, you can just read down that list. So these are things that we're already working on. Wildlife, that'll be out next year. That's already been through peer review. Climate change projections, bring in Lewis Iverson. Urban soils, we have someone working on the Century model with us. We talked about pollen. You can just read these. These are all things that we're working on that some are very close to being done, some will take a year or two. There's a lot more coming, and we're still always looking for ideas from people or partners with the idea of doing resiliency and biodiversity. If people have ways to tie structure to functions, we're looking, if you're an expert in that area, we'd be glad to talk to you. I think this is the last slide. We're also going into mobile apps, trying to tie on your phone back to design, so very simple to engage people of measuring a tree and getting sort of instantaneous measurements of services. So you can add inventories, good for education. We're working, Dave Bologniars and others are working on an education program with various cooperators. Citizen science, we think this mobile app will help develop some of those opportunities. So that's all I have on the update. appreciate your time. I think I can take some more questions here.